Hi, I'm Birgit O'Connor and welcome to my garden. Today I'm going to show you how to take a small flower and create a dramatic painting. Most people, when they think of small flowers, think of lots of flowers, bunches, or bouquets. I'm going to actually simplify the composition and work only on one, work with complementary colors, shapes, and shadow. So let's go to the studio and let's get started. Now before we begin, let me go over a few of the materials I'll be using. I'll use a large wash bucket. This way I don't have to change my water as often. I'll keep my palette vertically so it takes up less room. And since I'm right-handed, I'll keep it on the right-hand side. For my brushes, I'm going to use a number 8, 14, and 20 blend brush, along with a number 30 Cosmotop mix brush, which is all natural. You can also use a mop if you'd like, but the mop is much rounder and this has a nice point to it so I can get into the corners. I'll also use a bamboo hake brush to apply large amounts of water to the largest areas. For my paper, I'm going to use 300-pound cold press Arches paper. Now before I came into the studio, I actually took a digital picture of the pansy. This way I was able to capture the shadow and the composition that I liked. When it comes to transferring your image onto watercolor paper, there's a few different things that you can do. You can actually sketch it freehand onto sketch paper, and then take tracing paper, lay it over it, and use a permanent Sharpie marker to do the outline. Then bring it to a window and use the window as your light table. If that doesn't work for you, you could always grid the design and lay it onto watercolor paper. Or if you have a computer, you can blow it up in sections, sketch it out, transfer it on, use the window as your light table, or you could even go to a Kinko's or some type of copy store and do the same thing. Whatever's going to work the best for you. So when it comes to matching the color, it's really not that important to me. I'll be somewhere close to it, but it doesn't have to be exact. What I'll do is I'll mix my color in my palette and then test it onto a piece of scratch paper and then put the name of the combination next to it so I always remember what colors created what combination. I may even do a little sketch so I have some idea of how I want to approach the painting before I begin. So now we're ready to get started. The challenge of this composition is working with complementary colors. Complementary colors side by side are very vibrant, but when mixed together, they turn into a neutral gray. Once I've simplified my composition and created my line drawing, I can start adding water with my bamboo hake brush, then color to my larger shapes first. You'll want to make sure that you've covered the entire petal with water and that there's no dry areas. Otherwise, you'll have uneven color. I want to know that these areas are successful before I work on the details. Now in my palette, I'm going to want to take a little Naples yellow and add into it either New Gamboge or a little Indian yellow. The Naples yellow is a really nice soft color, and it will really complement the purple. I'll apply my brushstroke just along the pencil line and allow the pigment to run into the clean water. I don't want to fill this petal with color, I only want to give an accent of it along the edge. Then with my number 30 natural hair brush, I'm going to soften the edges. I don't want the color to stop short and create hard lines. At this stage, if I add too much yellow, when I add the purple, it can dull it down and not make the painting as vibrant. My intention is to have the two colors side by side and not really on top of each other. When I'm done adding just enough color to give the petal a little bit of a hue, I'll move on to the next one. Then repeat the process by applying water and then color along the edges. Then to help remove any of the brush strokes and blend the color better, I'm going to lift and tilt the paper and move the color in the clean water. Then I'll let this start to dry. In the meantime, I'll prepare the color for the center. I'm going to use a little Winsor dioxin and a lot less water. Then using a number 8 round synthetic, I'm going to apply the color on the inside, brushing out. The pencil line will be my guide, but I'm not going to follow it exactly. I also want the surface to be a little more matte. This means that there's not as much shine on the paper. The reason for this is that I'll have more control over my color. Then I'll work on the next one. Since watercolor dries about 20% lighter, I really want to make sure that I saturate these areas. When applying the brush stroke, press and lift when you go out to the edge. You don't want to hold the tip on the paper too long, otherwise you'll end up with a round mark, which can look like an exclamation point. Here I'll show you what I mean. I'll take a wash brush and apply a light layer of water onto the scrap piece of paper. Then I'll use a number 8 blend brush and apply a stroke of color. Notice how I'm applying pressure and then lift my brush as I move out to the edge. If I place the stroke on the paper and continue and don't lift it, you can see how there's a round ball at the end of it. This is what you'll want to try to avoid. Brush and lift. You'll want it to be tapered. At this stage, I'm really not too concerned whether or not the color is feathering a little bit. It really doesn't matter. The feathered edges will actually help to give me a softer look and will work quite nicely in the completed painting. Now, while my color is still wet, I'm going to take a number 8 round synthetic with a little new gamboge. I'll want a more concentrated color here, so I'll use less water. I'll want to place my brush stroke far enough away that I'm not mixing the two colors together as I move along. Otherwise, it can turn into a gray. I want the yellow just far enough away that only the edge touches the purple. This way, the two complementary colors side by side will be more vibrant. Now this stage will have to dry before I continue. Now when it's ready, I'll apply the next layer as a dry brush technique. What this means is I'm applying a fairly dry brush to dry paper. Notice how I start in the center and then brush out, lifting my brush to create that tapered edge. The purpose of this is to give the impression of detail, but I don't want it to just look like lines. So using a round number 14 blend brush, I'm going to fill in more of the color in between the lines, leaving only the points exposed. Then when I'm satisfied with my color application, when it's still just a little wet, I'll take a clean number 20 round brush and soften some of the edges. This way it'll look more natural and not as severe. Once I've randomly softened some of the edges, I'll need to let this dry. It usually takes me up to 3 or 4 layers to build the color that I want. Then I'll move on to the next petal and to the largest purple area in the center of the flower. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I have my yellow combination along the edges. Then using either a large natural round brush, a mop, or even a wash brush, I want to make sure that the surface is evenly damp and that there are no dry areas. This way the color will be able to move and blend easily on the surface. But before I apply the color, I want to make sure that the glisten has left the surface and that it's a little more matte in appearance. This way I'll have more control over the color. I'll be using the same purple as I did in the previous areas. I like to use a mix of French ultramarine blue, permanent alizarin crimson, along with carpazoli violet or Winsor dioxin. But don't be afraid to try your own color combinations. See what you like. As I mix my color, I want to make sure that I don't have as much water, that the brush is drier, and that I have actually more pigment with less water. This way, I'll have more control when I apply it to the damp surface. And as the area that I'm working with gets larger, I always increase the size of my brushes. You can see how I'm using my pencil line as a guide, but I'm not following it exactly. It helps me know how far to paint and what shape I need to create. I'm not trying to be photorealistic. I want more freedom than that. Then when I think I've applied enough color, I'll move on to the next area. I'm going to turn my paper upside down so I can reach other areas more easily. Then using a large brush such as a number 30 Cosmotop mix or a mop brush, I'm going to apply water to one of these areas. Then I'll load a number 20 round blend brush and apply it to the corner and work my way around the previous petal. The water that's already on the surface helps the color to move and blend just a little easier. What I'd like you to notice is within this color mixture, there's two different shades. One has just a little more blue, while the other has a little more red. Then as I start to get into the smaller areas, I'm going to reduce the size of my brush to a number 8. This helps me to have more control over the placement of color as I move along the edge. Then I'll move on to the next area. Again, I'm choosing to work with my largest shapes first. I'm going to fill this area with clean water using my bamboo hockey brush. I'll apply the water more in the center, leaving the edges dry. This way I won't overlap the pencil line. I like this brush because it holds a lot of water and it can give me more of a puddle instead of an even layer. You'll be able to see what I'm talking about in just a moment. I'm going to load a number 20 round blend brush and apply the color in the corner and allow the rest of it to spill out into the clean water. Watch as it moves and flows on the surface. This is because there's enough water so the pigment can travel, and that I haven't soaked my paper to remove the sizing. I'm intentionally going to try to retain some of these lighter areas to help give the impression of highlights. Then I'll tilt my paper so the color can blend and even out. This is another reason why the amount of water is very critical. I'll allow this to dry before I continue. Then I can come back in and work on the center petal and repeat the color application. Once that area is dry, I can work on the center of the flower. Here I'll be using the dry brush technique. That means working on dry paper. I'm going to load my brush with a little new gamboge and just a touch of permanent alizarin crimson. This way it's not such a bright yellow, it's a little toned down. I'll work my way around, filling in the white area of the center. Then I'll need to let this dry. Before I continue, I'll need to make sure that this area is completely dry. If it's cool to the touch, it's still too damp. The reason for testing it is that I want a nice crisp line. I don't want any bleeding or feathering color, especially since I'll be placing the complementary color in an extremely dark value next to it. I'll be using my number 20 round blend brush and working on dry paper. This way, I'm more likely to get the richest and darkest color that I can get, and it won't be diluted by water. I want it to be striking. Notice how I'm applying my brush strokes in the center, then brushing out. At this point, I'm just building my color, and if I need to, I can always add more. Then using a number 30, I'll soften some of the edges. because I want it to be natural and not look like brushstrokes. Then I'll move on to the other two similar areas and repeat this application. I'm using the previous layer as my guide as to where to place the brushstrokes in color. This is what I would call the awkward or adolescent stage of the painting. It's somewhere between the beginning and the end, and it's not at its best point right now. I'll continue adding the color until all three areas are basically the same value. And remember, once I've applied my brushstrokes, I'll take a large clean brush and soften some of the edges so it doesn't look like lines. Then I'll go back to some of the other purple petals and start deepening the value there. The contrast of light and dark is what's going to give this small little flower depth and drama. For the second layer, I'm going to be using a number 20 round blend brush and apply the color directly to dry paper. This way, it'll hold the integrity of the color. The areas that I'm applying the darker color to are the areas that I want to push back. If I've missed a spot or need to get into a small tight area, I'm going to reduce the size of my brush. As I apply the color, it's not important for me to cover the entire petal. In fact, I intentionally want to leave some areas where I don't apply color. What I want is some variation to help give this area the appearance of highlights. Then before the color dries, I'll take a large natural brush and soften some of the edges. The natural brush is softer and is less likely to pick up the color of the previous layer. Then I'll turn the painting around to get a better perspective and see how it looks. Then if I'm happy with it, I'll go on to the next petal and do the same application. You can begin to see how the darker color next to the lighter one actually brings clarity and a crispness to the painting. I'll then allow these two areas to dry and deepen the color with more layers as needed. Then I'll do the same thing with the center. If I really want to make it dramatic, I'm going to go darker with the color. I'm going to apply strokes of color and soften the edges. This application helps to build color and hide any of the imperfections of the previous layer. Then I'll move on to the top center petal to help roll it over and give it some shape. Using the wet into wet technique, I'm going to apply clean water to the inside of this petal. Then using a number 20 round blend brush, I'm going to apply color along one edge and allow it to blend into the clean water. This will help give it the appearance of rolling over. Once this area dries, I'm going to start adding some of the shadows. That's what's going to give this painting depth. Now taking the same complementary colors that I have in my petals, instead of placing them side by side, I'm going to combine them on my palette. When mixed together, these two colors become more of a neutral gray. And the opposite is true when placed side by side. They both become more vibrant. I'll play with it for a minute to find what value and what hue I like. Then I'll take a scrap piece of watercolor paper and test the color combination. This will be fine for the lighter shadows, but for some of the areas that I want to push back, I'll need to go darker. By adding a little indigo, French ultramarine blue, or a little burnt umber, I'll be able to keep the color basically within the same range, but just deepen the hue. If I think the color is just a little too dull, to help liven it up, I'll add a little more violet. Then I'll continue mixing the color until I'm happy with it. But before I apply it to a flower, I'm going to always test the color first on a scrap piece of paper. Here you can see the wide range of shadow color I can get. Now this is all going to depend on what proportion of color to color I use. When it comes to adding the shadows, there's actually a couple different techniques that I can use. Wet into wet and wet on dry. You can see that I've already applied the shadow to the petal on the left. Here I used the wet into wet technique, applying water first, color, then allowed it to dry. For the center petal, I'll be using more of a dry brush technique, a loaded brush on a dry surface. Since I already have so much color on the petal from the previous layers, I don't want to use as much water, or it could actually lift the pigment and make it bleed. At this point, this is when you want to make sure that you're using a natural hair brush, because it's less likely to lift color and leave brushstroke marks. You can see that I'm painting over the yellow center. That's because it's in the shadow. I wouldn't want to paint these two areas separately, otherwise I would have hard lines. Using my large natural hair brush, I'm going to decide which edges I want to leave hard or soften. Then I'll continue working my way around the flower, deciding where I want my other shadows to go. This is when you're really starting to use your values. The lightest colors are going to come forward. The middle tones will start to recede. The darkest colors are going to be in the back. Now once I have my shadows in, I can start thinking about the center of the flower and how I want to start bringing some of the detail out. I'm going to use a mixture of French ultramarine blue and permanent sap green. Then using a number 3 round synthetic brush, I'm going to just add a little detail to give a suggestion of the center of the flower. I don't want to do too much. By using only a couple brush strokes, it can be very effective. Then I'll need to fill in the remaining white areas. I'll start with the edges on the lip of the petals. I'll use a number 8 round blend brush and fill in the edges with a very light value of the same petal color. You can see that this little flower done on a quarter sheet of watercolor paper doesn't have a lot of detail. But what makes this painting interesting is that this pansy is created with complementary colors. Now the complementary color is on the opposite side of the color wheel, and the split complement is on either side of the complementary color. I'm using basically 2 colors for this painting, which is the violet and the yellow. Now if I mix those 2 colors together in a 50-50 proportion, I'll get a neutral gray, which is basically what I used in the shadows. Now if I take the split complementary colors, which are on either side of the yellow, I'll use the orange for the center and the yellow-green for the background. You can see how when this is placed next to the painting, the colors appear more lively. By using complementary and split complementary colors, it's almost a foolproof way of creating vibrant color in your paintings. Then I'll move on to the background and fill the stem area with clean water. As you can see, I still have a little color on my brush, but I'm not going to worry about it at this moment. I'm going to use a mixture of permanent sap green and new gamboge. Then I'll apply my color and allow it to run into the water, leaving less color in the center of the stem to be the highlight. As the stem starts to dry, I'm going to deepen the value using permanent sap green and a little French ultramarine blue. Then I'll go along the petal line and fill in the area and allow some of the color to run into the drying stem. This way the background will not compete with the flower. To give it more of a muted appearance, I'm going to add a little bit of the violet into the green and let it run. Then I'll continue to build and layer color as needed. And I'll use a combination of hard and soft edges. Then I'll let this dry. Now you have a better idea of how to take a simple little flower and turn it into a dramatic painting by using the complementary colors, split complementary colors, and shadows. Well, thank you for joining me today, and I hope that you've had fun, and that you feel that you now know how to create compositions from these tiny little flowers. So until next time, have fun and happy painting.